Hi everyone, it's Yvette Blowitz from SpiritGirl.com and welcome to the Spirit Girl Talk Show podcast. I'm super excited to be here with you today and our very special guest, who is Tom Stuart-Smith, a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and author of The Well-Gardened Mind, a Sunday Times bestseller, and listed as one of the 37 best books of 2020 by The Times, and the Gardening Book of the Year by the Sunday Times. And the great news is The Well-Gardened Mind is now available on audio, so you can do your gardening and listen to Tom Stuart-Smith. But Sue, welcome to the Spirit Girl podcast show. It's an honor, and I'm super grateful to have you here.
Oh, Yvette, thank you for asking me. I'm really delighted to be joining you today.
Yes, well, I know all of our audience will be super excited you're here because I've had many of our Spirit Girl Book Club community and podcast listeners who have been buying your book from Booktopia already, reading it and loving it. So naturally, I wanted to share more about you and your book and the benefits of gardening and connecting with nature and what it can do to our mental health or for our mental health. So, Sue, before we dive into your book, are you happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, where do I start, really? I think anyone who's read the book will know that I actually started out reading English. I did an English literature degree at Cambridge, and it was really only when my father became very ill and died towards the end of my studies at university that I began to think about training as a doctor. I'd loved reading English, and I still read a lot, but I felt I wanted to do something that was really engaging with other people, and I suppose, you know, helping people. So I changed, and I finished my degree and studied medicine, and then realized that what I was interested in most was the mind, and I became a psychiatrist and then a psychotherapist. So I did a very long training, and actually, in a funny way, I feel that sort of brought me full circle, because psychotherapy is so much about people's life narratives, you know, and in a way it sort of brought me back to the idea of people's life stories, you know, the link with literature and storytelling. So that's sort of my background, my journey in terms of my profession. In my personal life, which is equally important for this book, because really the book brings together the two sides of my life. I met my husband Tom when we were both at Cambridge. He at that point was just setting out on training to be a landscape architect, and we married quite young. We married in our mid-20s, and we're incredibly fortunate. His family have a plot of land about 20 miles north of London in Hertfordshire, where his parents had a barn that was falling down. And his father had the idea of converting it, of saving it. And we got the opportunity to live there, we moved. We're still here. That's where I'm talking to you from. We moved here in 1987. And then slowly, very, very slowly, began creating a garden around it, because the barn was situated in on top of a very windy hill. So it was very exposed. It was north-facing hill. So little by little, we created shelter and created gardens, and all the while, Tom was developing his career as a garden designer. And you know, in the course of time, he's become very well recognized and successful. So it's been an extraordinary journey, really, that we've been on together in that respect. And the book does reflect that, I think, my journey too, because I was actually quite skeptical about gardening when I first married Tom, bizarre as it may sound. I saw it as something a bit like outdoor housework. I didn't really understand. I didn't really connect with the soil, and yeah, it took a while, and once I started actually germinating plants from seed, I was hooked. So eventually it got to me.
Wow, that's an incredible journey. And first of all, Sue, sorry to hear about your loss of your father. That would have been really difficult at that time, and I'm sure many of our listeners can resonate with loss at some point in their life or most recently. And Sue, it's so interesting that I've seen videos of your garden. I've seen many photos of your garden, and it's just so beautiful. It's so like everything we dream of when it comes to the British country style magazines or the country life, you know. It's really beautiful. So when you went there to this barn, obviously you're looking at this land. Did you over the years just plant different things and, like, obviously with your husband, map out where things were going? How did that process work?
It has to be said that the design of the garden is very much Tom's creative vision, you know, and he's a real plantsman. He knows a great deal about plants, and in that respect, I've always been sort of tagging along behind him, I would say. And for me to see those changes has been extraordinary, really. And I've obviously learnt a huge amount from him. In terms of how we garden here, I think for the sort of area of the garden that I sort of have most influence over and spend most time in, and really kind of, you know, plan and create myself is our vegetable garden, and that's really what I think, you know, hooked me into gardening, because I've always loved cooking, and for me that connection between the garden and food was enormously important, sort of, you know, early on when I was beginning to get excited about gardening. So that's also a very, very important aspect of it for me. But even so, in the veg garden, I grow lots and lots of flowers as well, because I love cutting flowers and bringing them into the house. So it's not an entirely productive garden. There's also a great deal of sort of colour and beauty in it.
Well, your face is glowing with happiness and joy and fulfillment. And I can't help think, when you're doing this gardening, when it comes to the benefits of our mental health, is it really like that dopamine effect or the feeling of well-being, where you plant a little seedling, you get to nurture it, and then eventually you get to watch it either grow into a vegetable or a beautiful flower, and you feel that reward? How does that process work, Sue, with our mental health?
I think the really extraordinary thing about gardening is the many different levels on which it helps us. So yes, you're right. There's a physiological level and a brain chemistry level, which it certainly involves our reward systems, our dopamine systems, you know, because one of the great things about gardening is that it's intrinsically forward-looking. You know, when we sow our seeds, we're part of our mind is engaging in the future in a positive way. We're looking forward 2 or 3 months and, you know, anticipating whether it's the produce, the tomatoes or the squash plants or the beautiful flowers. So that effect is a very powerful one, and I think it's undoubtedly really come into its own with the pandemic that we're living through at the moment. You know, if you think, certainly last spring in the Northern Hemisphere, people were sowing seeds. I mean, the garden centres couldn't keep up with the demand, and if you think about it, everybody was firstly very afraid. But also they couldn't look forward to anything because all our plans were cancelled. Everything was postponed or cancelled. But gardens gave people a way of shaping a little bit of a future for themselves. So that's a very important aspect of the therapeutic dimension to gardening. But the other aspect, I think you mentioned care, and I think culturally, we live in a world that is so much caught up with consumption, that care's come to be devalued in a way, or not seen as something that might boost our self-esteem, or have intrinsic rewards to it. It's very easy these days to see care as something that's a sort of a demeaning activity, or a depleting activity, sort of drains our energies. And of course, care can be, if you take on too much, it will be, or if too much is imposed on you. But small acts of care are bound up with our endorphin system, so our natural opioids. So that in itself has a kind of a mood boosting, anti-stress, pleasurable aspect to it. But gardening also, I think, puts us in touch with much deeper existential issues, about the source of life, and the cycle of life. So I think in terms of how gardening can help people recover from experiences of trauma or loss, that working with the cycle of regeneration and then decline and decay in the garden, and then renewal again, is fundamentally so important, in terms of just giving a sense of hope, but also helping us accept that we're biological beings too, and there is no escaping the fact that things die in the garden. So I think it's a place where we can reconcile ourselves to all sorts of fundamental realities, actually.
Yeah, wow, Sue. So
when
we're in,
way, I think gardening helps people do that in a very gentle way. A garden is a very safe setting. It's a very soothing setting. Or I mean, as long as it's not a massively overgrown garden that's, still one would fill you with dread, as it were, about how on earth you're going to tackle it. But on the whole, a beautiful garden is about the safest and most sort of soothing setting you could find yourself in.
Yeah, and calming, isn't it? Very calming and tranquil. And it's interesting, Sue, you talked about they're very healing. I've heard many people who have lost a loved one and talked about planting trees in honor of their loved one, or rose bushes or flowers and things like that. Or many people suffering loss and going through grief and depression, spending time in the garden, and that helping with their rehabilitation.
I think that's right. I think working with the natural world, connecting with nature in that way, it exposes us to the transience of life. Everything's always changing in the garden. The flower that blooms doesn't bloom for that long. You have to come into that moment and value it for that moment. But we also experience a sense of the continuity of life at the same time. And that combination of transience on the one hand and continuity on the other. I talk in the book about symbolic survival. So what you're talking about, planting a tree in memory of a loved one, is about symbolic survival, the idea that something survives, which is enormously important to us in dealing with grief.
And so it's interesting, we're talking about, you touched on this earlier about vegetables and you loving growing them and then cooking with them. And my auntie messaged me today, and my uncle's visiting, and she's going out to her garden and getting her pumpkin, and she's making pumpkin soup for him, and she's so excited, and she's beside herself because she's so happy that this pumpkin's grown, and the reward of going to get it out and then making it for family pumpkin soup. So I can see why you get so excited, and many of our listeners, growing your own produce
Yeah.
and then getting it out, and then being able to eat it and cook with it and share it is just so so incredible.
It's about recognizing what nourishes us, I think. And at every level, you know, that's not just food. I think, you know, natural beauty, or beauty in any form, really is a form of nourishment. You know, the effects on the brain make that clear. That sort of, yeah, being able to nourish ourselves through the garden is enormously helpful. And I think you know, in this pandemic time when people are so socially isolated, there's also a form of companionship that people can experience through plants and through their gardens. And that's, you know, again, I touch on that in the book because that's an enormously important effect for people who are in hospital, for example, or towards the end of life. You know, the very real value of gardens in those settings is, I think, finally coming to be recognized after you know, half a century, I think, of gardens really not being incorporated into healthcare. You know, they're coming back again. You know, of course, they had their great heyday in the Victorian era and before that. But I think it's good. I think we are recognizing the importance of all these things in a new way.
Yes, so your book has really highlighted the importance of gardening, or really made us all think, if we don't have a garden, how can we get involved in gardening, whether that's a community garden, or how can we get in touch with nature? And so many people we're seeing over in places like Japan, they're going out to nature, leaving the high rise. Many people in New York City are trying to get to Central Park, and other places people are trying to bring plants in. Would you say, Sue, when you're working with the soil, however, it's very grounding, or just even being in nature in general, isn't it? It can be very calming for our central nervous system and very grounding.
Yes, I think it is, and there's a lot of interesting research on the effects of nature, for example, on our attention. So, you know, the nature of much 21st century life and working life is that, particularly screen-based life, we're really only using one part of our brain a lot of the time. You know, our focus gets fragmented. We switch from one task to another. We're engaging quite a narrow focus in terms of our attention. And when we go out into nature, the brain employs a different kind of attention. It's really what you know, we evolved as hunter-gatherers. So this is what our hunter-gatherer forebears were using, you know, when they were walking out in the landscape, a very broad form of attention, which involves the brain in a much more integrated way, much more multisensory way. You know, we're not focusing in on one tiny thing, taking in the whole landscape, if you like. And there's also evidence that the patterns in nature, the fractal patterns in the trees, the branches, these are patterns that that repeat themselves. You know, that like the way a tree branches, and then the leaves. Actually, if you look on the leaf, you almost see in miniature the same branching structure of the tree. So nature is full of fractal patterns, and these are much easier, much less demanding on the brain to read. So our urban landscapes are full of kind of irregular, unnatural sort of shapes, if you like. And it's just simply a bit harder work. The eye has to make many more fixations to read an urban landscape than a natural landscape. So this effect is happening, you know, on such a sort of multi-level, you know, basis, really. That it's, you know, it's one of the things I really try to dig into in my book, you know, is these many different aspects of it. And you know, it's why it took me a long time to research the book. I spent 5 years researching the book.
Well, I'm just fascinated, Sue, with your book. You have been doing psychiatry for so long in your role, but how did the book come about with the title and the whole book come to fruition? When did you decide, all right, I'm going to sit down and write a book?
Well, that's a good question, because I don't know. I think I like to think I might have written the book anyway, but it came about. The idea really came about in 2013 when a friend of ours called Christopher Woodward, who's the director of the Garden Museum in London, approached Tom and me about running a small festival, a summer festival, a literary festival in our garden. And we were delighted by the idea. And at the very first planning meeting, he said to me, "Oh, and Sue, I think you're going to talk about gardening for the mind." And I sort of thought, oh, okay. Yeah, maybe I could do that. I'd like to do that. So I set about writing this talk, and it was really in writing that talk that I realised how much I had to say about it, and how I think quietly I had been thinking about it without being really aware of it. You know, I'd always seen my gardening life as separate from my working life. But I think I had been, you know, weaving the two together in my own mind, not particularly consciously, but it was as if it surfaced, and I'm very grateful to Christopher for sowing that seed, actually, and getting me going. But also the other thing that was really important about that was in the course of writing that talk, I sort of reconnected with my grandfather's story, which was very much one of the inspirations behind the book. And I went, you know, to find out more from my mother, because I'd grown up knowing that he had suffered terribly during the First World War as a very young man. He'd been captured in Turkey in the run-up to the Gallipoli invasion. He'd spent the whole of the First World War in a series of brutal labour camps, and he was lucky to survive. But he was very, very malnourished and traumatized at the end of the war. And it was really only in 1920 when he got the opportunity to enroll on a year-long course of horticultural rehabilitation that he began to fully recover his physical and mental health. You know, my grandmother had nursed him before that and really helped him a great deal. But that was life-changing for him, and he was left with a lifelong love of gardening. And my mother grew up on a small holding, and during the Second World War, you know, their family were pretty self-sufficient, and they had bees and an orchard and kept a pig and so on, as well as growing lots of food. So that was there in my background, but it was very much as kind of latent. It was latent in me, and that also came up to the surface, and I began to think about that, and I started researching. You know, that's it. That story's in the book. I find the place where he did that course, and learn a bit more about his experiences, and write about them. So yeah, the book was quite a journey for me, really.
Wow, that's such an incredible story, Sue. Just hearing about your grandfather's story, when we look at recovering from trauma, and back in those days wasn't the treatment there is today with the modern, you know, medication and the psychiatrist at the ready, or psychologist. And to think that the power of horticultural and gardening could help rehabilitate him from the war and the torture and all of the trauma, it's really reassuring. And especially now with all your research and personal experience, really reassuring for anyone who's tuning in and going through a really difficult time, and maybe has a garden and not been in there, or, you know, it's reassuring that there's always hope, isn't there? And especially can be found in the garden or by gardening, and really that therapeutic way.
Yeah. No, I think there is. I think I would add something to that, which is that, you know, I visited a lot of mental health projects, including some projects for veterans recovering from PTSD and servicemen as well. And I think that, you know, there's people's own personal gardens on the one hand, and how much they can benefit from it as an individual. But there's also something else that happens in, let's say, a community garden or a more formal therapeutic project, which is also about the human element. And gardens have a very unique way, I think, of helping people connect with each other. You know, they're an unthreatening space. And I mentioned before the safety people feel in the garden. That's really crucial for anyone recovering from PTSD, for example. The feeling of enclosure that you can have in a garden. Enclosure, but there's an element of openness too. You're not sort of trapped. But you know, I was really struck and learned a lot from the horticultural therapists who I met in the course of writing the book. You know, the skill that they bring to creating a therapeutic environment within a garden is an enormously important part of it. You know, and I'm sure my grandfather had that. I mean, one of the things that came to light was via my cousin, was the letter that he was given at the end, written by his instructor, as it were. You know, and it sort of detailed the kind of experiences that he'd had, what he'd learned to grow. He'd actually learned to grow a lot of exotic plants in this place as well, because it was a really amazing garden with lots of glass houses. But it struck me reading this letter, because it's a nice letter written about him, you know, that his relationship with that instructor must have also been important. And I think it's one thing is, I really do feel very strongly in terms of us coming out of this pandemic and the social isolation that we've all experienced, is that community gardening could really have a great deal to offer people, because it's a sort of, and in the context of the virus particularly, it will feel like a very unthreatening way for people to come together, or a safe way for people to come together, you know, with shared tasks, shared pleasures. So much of gardening is about shared pleasures, whether that's in the food or the beauty that's being created. So yeah, I think one has to think about that as well, and the way that human connection is actually fostered through connection with nature.
Wow, Sue, I just, listening to your words there, couldn't help think, when it comes to the recovery and mental health, overcoming trauma, and overcoming so many things that people are going through, because like you said, there are people returning from war, or people who are got post-traumatic stress disorder from whatever trauma they've gone through. So we've always had these things happening in the community, and it's now been escalated through COVID-19. But coming together as a community and being self-sufficient and gathering, and it just seems like such an incredible way to reconnect. Because you're right, in person and in the garden, and it just sounds like a really marvelous thing to do. So I'm sure there'll be some of our podcast listeners that are like, oh, Sue, why didn't I think of that? And even if it's only with their gathering, even if they start out small with their family or their neighbours, you know, or their immediate people in their street, if they don't want to take on the big council garden. But
these things can be very, very small. I mean, if you know, I write about the Incredible Edible project in the book, which started in Todmorden, just outside Manchester, and it was a group of women who wanted to help the town recover. It was a town that had been languishing for some time, a sort of post-industrial town, had been a thriving mill town once in the, was right at the heart of the Industrial Revolution way back. But the crash of 2008 really hit it badly. And they just set out planting up neglected areas within the town and derelict areas, planting them up with food that people could, forage for and harvest. It was open to anybody to harvest and collect. And little things like they planted herbs outside the butcher's shop so that people could pick herbs on their way out of the shop. And it's it really kick-started a bit of a transformation in Todmorden, and actually has gone on and spawned a worldwide movement of incredible edible gardens. So there's a lot that you can do that's very simple ways of people coming together and making these interventions really.
Such a incredible story, that one. I can't help think, makes you want to run out. You feel so inspired to want to run out and do a little random act of kindness and start growing, flowers around the place and herbs and food. Sue,
yeah,
when
actually,
I
this is one of the slogans for the Incredible Edible is that they use the currency of kindness. That's their approach.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. I think one of the things that's a lot of people are sharing with me, Sue, is when they're growing their own vegetables or fruit, whatever it might be, they feel very empowered. Like, it doesn't matter what happens in the world, I'll be able to feed myself and my family. They feel like they're in control. Like, as long as I can create food and grow food, I'm okay.
Yeah.
Is that a natural instinct?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think given the very uncertain times that we're living in, I find gardening very empowering. I find, we're not self-sufficient by any means, but we grow a lot. And it never ceases to sort of delight me and reward me. And yeah, I think that feeling of being able to stand on your own 2 feet in a way, is in a fundamental way, feed yourself and feed your family is a very important part of it. And in terms of kind of gardening's potential to have transformative effects on people, that particular effect, that empowering effect, that sort of self-esteem, self-belief effect came across very, very strongly in the interviews that I did with prisoners on gardening projects, for example. And these were men and women who wanted to change their lives, but they couldn't really see how. But gardening gave them a sense of actually that they could do something worthwhile. They could produce something that would give somebody else pleasure, as it were, or they could feel proud of at a fundamental level. And gardening is very good at that, and very helpful for kids, for example, and teenagers who are not thriving in the education system. I feature a couple of projects working with at-risk kids, and again, that effect, that kind of getting their hands in the soil, engaging with nature in a very physical way, but at the end of the day, of course, not everything's under your control, but there is an element of control there, and that's part of gardening too, that you're constantly having to deal with things that aren't quite in your control, but actually at the end of the day they can stand back and feel really proud of what they've done, and that self-esteem effect has many applications in terms of the therapeutics of gardening and the kind of people that it can benefit, really, or situations in which it can be beneficial.
That is incredible, Sue, to hear of the transformations of the prisoners, and when we reflect on at-risk children or children who are in very domestic violence or situations that are not good at all, but to see a sense of proudness and building their self-esteem and learning the whole process of the gardening must be so calming for them and give them a sense of place.
Right. I mean, people often comment that, you know, in all these kind of projects that there's very, very rarely any aggression. People don't argue in the garden or have aggression. You know, it's in terms of prisons, certainly, you know, that projects report there's really very little violence in the garden, and I think that, or no violence, it just helped the calming surroundings really, really help. But also the mindful focus on the work. You know, one of the things gardening's very helpful for is getting into a flow state. You know, because whether it's weeding or, let's say, you know, potting up little seedlings or sowing seeds, you know, the focus, the brain, hand, mind connection, body connection, really that focus that's required is very good at bringing us into the present moment. And what many people report in the garden is a feeling of losing themselves in what they're doing. You know, that somehow their worries that may have been going over and over in their mind, or their self-critical thoughts, their negative thoughts, they go a bit quiet when we're engaged in those kind of activities. You can also get that effect. Many people get it from cooking, for example, you know, which has a similar rhythmical, meditative, you know, hand-eye coordination quality to it. So I think that's also a very, very important aspect of how calming gardening can be.
I think, and you're so right, Sue, when you speak about that flow state, and then just when you're, you know, having a complete break from the news or the stress or the thoughts or whatever might be going on, it's so therapeutic, isn't it? And really great for our mental health and well-being.
I think it's so important in the world that we live in now, because we're too, many of us most of the time are too connected, aren't we? We know notifications come through on our phone, and even if you're not intending to, you know, read the news, as it were, it somehow
pops up.
Pops up. So I think having that break, particularly from screens, is really beneficial, actually.
Because, see, when I grew up, Sue, I was really blessed that every weekend I was always out gardening as a little kid, and I loved it. I just really enjoyed getting my hands in, doing the plants, watching them grow. It was like the highlight of my childhood. I'm positive, that and reading books and sports, but I really, really enjoyed it. I think I really liked the process of it being dirt and nothing, quite horrible. I used to think it was horrible, but then we would plant these little pretty plants, the little seeds. You know, I used to go and get the little packets at the and it was so fascinating to put them in, and you know, it was my job to keep them watered, and I learned if I overwatered the plants or the seedlings, they wouldn't grow. So I learned a lot, but just then watching them blossom to come out, you know, the purple and the pink, and it was just such a beautiful experience as a kid too.
Yes, and I think it's also gardening is about delayed gratification too, isn't it? And we live in a world where you know, so dominated by sort of instant gratification. So I think that's another very helpful aspect of it. And also that lovely element of novelty or surprise you get in a garden. You know, you've planted something months ago and maybe even forgotten about it a bit, and then suddenly it comes into flower, and you think, oh wow, yeah, that's great. So I think that's also lovely. You know, I feel even in a small garden, there's always quite a lot going on, and you know, you do get these lovely moments of surprise. You know, nature surprises us,
And
that's great.
And, you know, so I think one of the things I learned, it was a good training ground to be in the gardening on the weekends, because I learnt from a young age I couldn't just sit inside and watch TV all day. I had to get outside. And because my mum was in the garden, but sort of down the other end, I learnt that you just had to attend to things. Now, I also learnt that weeds came up. And
Yes.
whilst that was one of the most, as a kid, I just wanted to do the seeds and then, you know, water it and wait for it all to blossom. But I learned that to get to this beautiful flower or plant, I had to do those jobs like weeding, because if I didn't do it and let it overgrow, like it would, my flowers wouldn't come out. So it was very, it's a really good thing, I think, learning as a child, because now I've learned you've got to do in life all these things that sometimes you really don't want to do, but it's necessary to sort of get to the end outcome of this beautiful flower. But so it's like, you're right, it's not instant gratification. But 3 months down the track, I could see the worth in doing those tasks that, you know, you tell a kid to go do weeding. That's the last thing we want to do on the weekend. I would rather, even back in those days, sit and watch cartoons or, you know, play with other kids. But it was just such a good upbringing to be in the garden and learn, like, we've got to, you know, look after this garden.
Yes, and you know, I'm a real advocate for children and gardening, and particularly school gardening, because I think it's not only that effect that's so important. I think given the you know, the planetary crisis that we're facing, you know, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, I think it's so important that children connect with nature in that way and understand the cycle of life in the garden and the source of their food and all these things. So I think it has many benefits to offer, really, at every level.
I think everyone's got to get a copy of your book, The Well Garden Mind, because it's just such a great read. But what I love, Sue, is you recorded it on audio. And
yes, I was very pleased.
fascinating.
I managed to do it just before the pandemic, so I was I'm really pleased about that. Yeah.
And it's incredible that your book came out. So you're writing this not knowing that the global pandemic was going to happen. And what people have expressed to me when they talk about your book is that it was like a timely book. I always say divine timing, because I'm seeing all these books pop up that can be so beneficial during the pandemic. Because when we think of mental health, sometimes you're a trained psychiatrist and we know about the medication and that part. But to be able to combine lifestyle practices and combining all of these tools or things or practices is just really incredible. And your book is so beneficial and really putting the spotlight on gardening, but in a really therapeutic way for our mental health and well-being. And just giving us so many ideas.
I wanted to create a book that kind of you know, because there are quite a lot of life stories in it. So people that I encountered and interviewed on the one hand, there's quite a lot of research in it in terms of the evidence, and also quite a lot about my own experiences in gardening. So I wanted to create a book that was both a kind of in-depth exploration of the value of gardening, but also in terms of reading it, gave people something of those experiences themselves, you know, that actually they would feel refreshed by reading, you know, an account of something that I describe in the garden. So I was hoping to do that. And as you say, little, you know, how could any of us have seen what was coming in terms of the moment that it was published? And actually I'd written in the book about the phenomenon that's called urgent biophilia, which has been observed following wars, following natural disasters, during wars as well. And I'd really looked at that in relation to the First World War, you know, not only my grandfather's experience, but other aspects of the turning to nature that happened during and after the First World War. And biophilia is our love of nature, our innate love of nature. And it's clear that at times of crisis, you know, looking back through history, we see how this emerges. People almost instinctively feel the need to reconnect with nature. And you know, the renewal of nature that we can experience is very sustaining to us in those kind of times. So I'd written all of this in the book, little knowing that the book would emerge during during an unprecedented crisis, really, when I think, you know, possibly our need for nature has been greater than in any other crisis that humanity has suffered, because you know, during a war or following a natural disaster, people can still come together. They can still they can hug each other. They can go and get drunk together, or what, you know, they can you know, cry together. They can console each other. They can have all that human connection that's so important. And we've been so deprived of that, which has made the kind of the experience of anxiety and trauma and losses that people have experienced in various ways so much harder to deal with.
You're so right, Sue. You really touched on something there. Like, we're finding that we're going back to some form of nature to connect. And I've spoken to people who are bringing plants in, or gardening, or going for walks in nature, because they can't actually connect to, like you said, to a loved one and hug them because they can't travel and see them. And so the isolation, whereas I have heard, like you mentioned just then, but in war times, you know, when the men or women would come back, they could, like you said, get together and rally, or you could come together as a group. But many restrictions when London was in lockdown, they weren't, I did hear they weren't allowed to drive around with a certain amount of people in the car.
No, we're still in lockdown. We're still not allowed to go into each other's houses.
Yes.
2 households are allowed to mix outdoors. And restaurants and pubs are, you know, providing food and drink, but only outdoors. So we're hoping to emerge more fully from it in the middle of this month, and then I think there's another level of restrictions lifting at the end of June. But no, we've had a really long period of lockdown. We had a long period at the beginning of the pandemic, and we've had a long period this winter.
It must be nearly, how many months is that now, Sue? That must be going on 4, 5.
4 months, over 4 months, yeah.
It's still a long time, isn't it? Where, like, a neighbour, because one of the podcast listeners at the start of the UK pandemic, the lockdown, was saying she couldn't go into her neighbour's house at that time, and they're an apartment complex. And I thought, oh, this is really cutting off social connection. Like, back in the day, she would have like dinner with this lady because they were both on their own, and, you know, drink and so forth and socialize. But really fascinating, Sue. I want to ask you, in your experience working in mental health, there's mixed emotions where people are saying it's good that people are openly talking about their mental health struggles or concerns or illnesses, or there's a big movement in trying to break the stigma. But then on the other hand, we've got people sadly critically ill with mental health, mental illness. And we know that so many people who maybe never experienced mental health issues or concerns or illness before, it's been triggered by the pandemic. What's your thoughts on where this is all heading, I guess, for mental health and the need for, I guess, psychiatrists and psychotherapists and psychologists? Everyone I speak to are run off their feet, really busy. They're saying that they're very concerned about mental health and the well-being of people.
I think it is a really serious concern, and I think the mental health consequences of the pandemic are likely to last a lot longer than the effects of the virus itself, because there's been so many, whether it's the economic effects, people losing jobs, people losing loved ones, people suffering long periods of isolation and disconnection. These have all taken a great deal of toll, and living with so much uncertainty and anxiety and so many restrictions for such a long period of time. And I think some people are also certainly here. I mentioned earlier that the gradual return coming out of lockdown that we're hoping will happen, but some people are very anxious about that as well, because they've had many months of lockdown life, and there are also anxieties about seeing people again and emerging, and it's not going to be easy at all. So I think the more we can just all keep talking about it and keep it on the agenda, I think one of the good things in a way is that it's whereas perhaps in other situations people might not have been able to speak so openly about their mental health struggles, I think the pandemic has made it all right, because everybody has been anxious, and therefore there's less stigma attached to less sense of weakness, as it were, or something that you're expressing anxiety. But I think in terms of thinking about resources and strategies, it's really got to be high up on the agenda as we come out of this.
Yeah.
Just to add, I do think one of the other positive aspects of the pandemic has been the very widespread around the world phenomenon of reawakening to the importance of nature and connection to nature for our well-being. So again, I think it's just important that we keep that going, keep the momentum going with that. And don't lose sight of it too quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Sue, for sharing your words of wisdom, because that was a real reason I wanted to have you on the podcast show, because the well-gardened mind, whether people read it, whether they have it in audio book, whether they just feel inspired and empowered today to think about how they can do gardening, how they can connect to nature, how can they really just use that to help with their mental health and well-being during the pandemic and beyond, because it's just so therapeutic and so beneficial. Like you said, the calming nature, helping to ease anxiety and overcome trauma, and help with grief and depression. And just the people I'm speaking to, along with yourself, Sue, who are gardening, they feel very optimistic. They feel like they're in control of their garden, and they've got a real sense of purpose. And then on the flip side, we can't travel international and our international borders are closed. Whilst I would normally travel international, I've accepted I can't, and it is what it is. And that's kind of like, I had to have that very approach, because if I really went down the rabbit hole of I can't travel international, some people have gone down the rabbit hole and gotten really depressed about it and feeling very depressed. I mean, I had my moments of depression that I can't travel international. I'm sure we've all had that, but I decided that you've got to focus on what you can do.
Yeah, what you can do,
what you can't do.
What's local, what's, I think this thing about, I think if you've got access to a garden, it does potentially offer you a little microcosm, a little world that you can explore and notice. And a lot of wildlife comes into a garden. And, increasingly people are planting more and more, the planting to encourage biodiversity, planting to encourage the insects, the birds, and so on. And that's really helpful for these kind of times, because the more life that comes into a garden, the more we can experience, in a sense, do a little travel around your garden every day when you can't travel very far. And, one of the examples I give in the book is Sigmund Freud, who for the last 16 years of his life was forbidden to travel because of his health. And, the garden and the villas that he rented each summer were enormously important to him. And he would walk around the garden every day, noticing what had changed, what was going on, and spent a lot of time on his garden bed, actually outdoors, just taking in all those changes. Often we're too busy to notice these things, or we're rushing from A to B. So there's a lot by slowing down that you can notice if you've got a little bit of nature around you.
I love that, by slowing down and a little bit of nature around you. And incredible stories, Sue, in your book, and incredible that you went to all of the research and then really put like a somewhat memoir intertwined with mental health and well-being, with real life stories and projects. And there's so much work that's gone into your book, Sue, and I thank you, because it's now such a gift. It really is such a gift, and we're all blessed that you went to all of the effort to do all of the work to pull it together, because there's such a variety and diversity in there. And like, it's incredible. One minute you're talking about these, little acts of kindness projects, and then your grandfather, and just so many elements. So, Sue, I could talk to you forever about gardening, because I just love it, obviously. But when I'm thinking of my mental health podcast, and the reason I have you on and many other authors, I look at mental health just not from a one dimension, just not medication or just not counseling, like a very holistic approach where it's medication or counseling or food or gardening or
all
walking,
these things matter, they all help. Yeah, they all help. It's not one or the other. Absolutely. I have a very holistic approach in that way too. Yeah.
And I just think there could be someone there thinking, you know what, I might give this a go.
Yeah.
Like,
well,
I hope so.
Yeah,
like that's the whole plan. I might have been busy as to date, but I've got this tiny little patch, and I might put some lettuce in or some cherry tomatoes, just one or two things, and nurture that and nourish that, and see if that helps make me feel better. So, Sue, before we say goodbye, you are giving so much. You are always helping other people to feel good with their mental health and their well-being. And you spend a lot of time out gardening, which I'd imagine keeps you quite fit and active and it's a form of mindfulness. But when it comes to taking care of yourself, what are some of your self-care rituals and things you like to do?
Oh, I think getting out in the garden every day is absolutely one of them. And one of my rituals is to go and harvest, even if it's just some herbs, but to harvest something each day and connect with the plants. And especially at this time of year when I've got lots of seedlings coming on, to go and sort of water them and see how they're see how they're growing, really. I take great pleasure from that. I'm also a great one for being quite as physical as I can during the day, though I do far too much of my time is screen based and desk based, so I like to walk as well, and swim. And then I'm a great believer in a really lovely warm bath at the end of the day as well. I find that in terms of self-care, that's one of my rituals. So yeah, all those things.
And it's so inspiring, Sue, when you're a psychotherapist, a psychiatrist, and even you can see the actual benefit of working, being really busy, and then needing to switch off, like from technology or TVs or screens, and connect with nature and take care of your own self. And I'm imagining, Sue, as someone who's always busy working and with clients and patients, you must have just felt that distinct switch off. Like, I often say to people, self-care is so important, isn't it? Especially during these times.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think people in the caring professions are so inundated with work at the moment that is more important than ever, really, to make sure people are finding that time for themselves, to replenish themselves, to recharge, and I think the other thing that as a family we always do is to make time to make some nice food in the evening and to sit and spend time eating together. I think that's another very important ritual of sharing food and having that time to connect with each other.
Yeah, and I love the well garden mind, but it just reminds me of, you can have a whole lot of stress going on, whether that be at work or in your life, and then you can go to this garden and totally get in the flow state, switch off, lose yourself, that ruminating mind about all the stress. It sort of can just, I guess, weed itself away in some direction, but just give people that even a gap where the mind's not thinking. It's so incredible. And you live this, Sue, which is even more incredible. You live it, do it, and such a great ambassador when it comes to mental health and gardening. So thank you again, Sue. You've really inspired me to want to just go out and do more gardening. And but I'm sure you're going to inspire so many of our Spirit Girl podcast listeners. If you're tuning in today, be sure. Sue, how can we stay in touch with you now after this podcast show?
Well, I have a website. It's just SueStuartSmith.com, and I'm on Instagram, on Twitter. So yeah, people can follow me if they like to follow me. But it's been a real pleasure talking to you today, Yvette. Thank you very much.
I love it. And I'd love for everyone to take a photo of their garden and actually hashtag Sue Stuart-Smith, hashtag the Well Garden Mind, especially if you grab a copy of her book, or if you are inspired to run out and do something in your garden. I just love to see everybody's garden photos and book photos, and even just to be able to read how it's made you feel. If there's any school teachers tuning in today, or people that work with at-risk kids or at hospitals. I don't know. It just, your message, Sue, and what you've written in the book and research really feels so empowering, that we all have the power to intertwine more of gardens into our life, whether we're developers. There's just so many opportunities. So I feel really hopeful that even in a global pandemic, there are ways that we can really get back out there and make a difference. And in a way where it's gardening or herbs or a little plant for someone, a little plant for someone else's garden. Maybe someone we don't even know. Maybe we leave it on their garden as a gift. But, there's just so many, there's so much hope coming from your book, Sue, and from this podcast. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sue. We'll say goodbye to Sue Stuart-Smith. It's been an absolute pleasure having on the Spirit Girl Talk Show podcast. Be sure to subscribe, to leave a rating and review, and tell someone you love to. And together, let's feel good from within. Bye for now. Bye.